Hello and welcome to all. Greetings to people across various time zones and regions. Today's event, Conversations Writing the Ocean as Method, is being hosted by Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, in collaboration with Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand, Ministry of Education, Government of India, Spark supported. Today's session will be hosted by Professor Nishat Zaidi and Professor Dilip Menon. Professor Dilip Menon is the Mellon Chair in Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand and the International PI for the Spark supported exchange program Cosmopolitan Cultures and Oceanic Thought Thinking Through History Across the Waters. Professor Nishat Zaidi is the head of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the PI for the Spark supported program. This event is the first event in the series, which we are calling as Conversations Writing the Ocean. We have with us today two extraordinary speakers, one from Kenya and the other one from Singapore, Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor and Alvin Pang. Professor Nishat Zedi will now introduce both of them. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Um, it is indeed a matter of great pleasure and honor for me to welcome Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor and Dr. Alvin Pang. Both of them, as Stephen rightly pointed out, extraordinary voices who have, in their own ways, dared to challenge the bastions of Euro-American, epistemological assumptions. Uh, a very warm welcome to you, Yvonne and Alvin. It's really, it's really great to have you both with us today. Four of us in this panel as we sit today, we are connected by a very fascinating circularity, as Dilip was pointing out, a while ago. I was introduced to Yvonne by Dilip, who gifted me a copy of the Dragonfly Sea. And, reading this novel was quite an extraordinary experience for me. It was a discovery, of a unique kind. I was totally stunned by the sheer vastness of novel's canvas, which spans, I think, 6 languages, 2 continents, in this transoceanic encounters of characters. Ancient history is deeply and very intricately entangled with contemporary politics in the novel. So that was my first exposure to Yvonne's writing, absolutely stunning and absolutely amazing. So, that took me to Yvonne's writings, and then slowly I discovered a little more about her writings. She's, as you know, a fiction writer from Kenya. She's also an academic and art curator. She published her first novel, Dust, in 2014, and it was also a kind of, a nation at war kind of novel. But what is most striking about that novel, as well as the Dragonfly Sea, is the, the beauty of language, the cadence, the lyricism of language, and the splintered lyricism of Dust is also as fascinating as that of the Dragonfly Sea. So, Yvonne, she has won many awards and accolades. Jomo Kenyatta Literature Award. She in 2003 she won Kane Prize for African, writing for her story Weight of Whispers, and so on and so forth. And another fascinating aspect of her personality is that she's also the executive director of Zanzibar International Film Festival. So in Zanzibar, Tanzania, and she's hosted the festival of Dhow countries. So, it's really a great pleasure to have you with us, Yvonne. And Alvin, as again Dilip pointed out, it's Yvonne, when we, Dilip and I were having these conversations about having this, this series, I approached Yvonne, and Yvonne introduced me to Alvin, and that's how we got introduced to Alvin's writing. Another fascinating poet and writer from Singapore. He's, of course, he's a poet and translator, but an equally fascinating editor and art activist. Again, he has won many, many awards. He was named the Young Artist of the Year for Literature by Singapore's National Arts Council in 2005, and he won Singapore Youth Award in 2007. He has published several collections of poems, and the titles are self-explanatory as far as his, concerns, thematic concerns, go. Testing the Silence, that was his first collection, which came out, I think, in 1997. Then he published City of Rain, which came out in 2003. Then he wrote this fascinating collection of poems, which is prose poems. He uses creative prose, what gives us our name, and then when the barbarians arrive. But for me, I also find his, work as curator very fascinating, because there is a certain ideology at work, and he's trying to explore the true Singaporean voice through his writings and through his, work as editor. So he has edited this volume called Union 15 Years of Drunken Boat, and Contemporary Writings from Singapore, which came out in 2009. Alvin's work has been fascinating, especially if you look at, if you watch some of his, YouTube poetry recitations. So he uses all this intermediality and transmediality, concepts. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Pang. It's really great for us to have both of you together to have this conversation about oceans and oceanic connections. So I also discovered that Alvin is same age as me. We born the same year. So so another fascinating fact for me. So very warm welcome to you once again. Maybe we can start by asking, both of you, because your locations are very important in your writings. So Dilip, if you agree, we can start them by asking about about their experience as writers, because we find that there's a lot of autobiographical elements in their writing. So is it does this resonate with your particular childhood experience? I mean, how do you visualize all this writing, and link it to your own personal experience? Yes.
First, I just want to first say thank you so much for having us both with you. It's such an honor and a pleasure. And either I or Yvonne are going to say this, so I might as well say it, which is that one more connection. Yes. Is that we met at the festival in Trivandrum.
Okay. Wow.
Yes. It's India that brought us together for a literary festival. And wow. Yvonne, should I tell the story, or will you tell
the story? It's important.
You tell the story. So we were placed, and it's relevant, right? We were placed entirely at random on a panel together. We were not meant to be at that panel. It was a programming glitch. And it turned out that she went first and then I went after. Doesn't matter. We were on the same panel. And there was this novelist from Kenya who went up and started reading this novel called The Dragonfly Sea. And the first thing she mentions is that it's based on the story of the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, who had traveled following the traditional oceanic trade routes, of course. Traveled all the way to places such as the eastern shore of the African continent, brought a giraffe back, etc., etc. And the novel's based on that. And do you remember what I said after you sat down, Yvonne? You continue.
So I'm reading this in Kerala, and for me at that moment, studying in Kerala was so important because there's a character who actually leaves Nairobi to go to Kerala. So I was having all sorts of these metaphorical, thematic moments within myself, and I'm reading, and I'm in it, and I'm looking across, and I'm seeing this guy who is restless, acting absolutely restless in his chair, and I'm thinking, is there something wrong with the way I'm speaking? Is there something terrible with it? Is there something terrible with the text? And And then when I go straight, my session ends, and by chance my seat was right next to his. He turns to me and says, "That is my relative."
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
No, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Essentially, no. I think I remember saying, "Did you know that Zhen He? You wrote about Zhen He is in your novel." And she said, "Yeah." Did you know Zhen He is my relative, my mother's side? It is true. My mother's
how exactly do you trace?
clan. I'm sorry, Dilip.
Now, I was going to ask, how exactly do you trace his lineage across?
Yes, that's what I asked him, exactly.
Zheng He was a eunuch, right?
Yeah.
He was a eunuch
No.
admiral.
So I'm not descended from him by any means,
right.
but we share common ancestry. And the thing is, on my mother's side, we do know, they keep all sorts of records. And my grandfather once brought my mother back to ancestral home in China, went to visit the ancestral graveyard, Muslim graves. And my mother was so struck, she told me, and there's no reason for her to make it up because she had no idea that there was this lineage, in our history. And one of the monuments in that ancestral graveyard was to Zhen He, and my grandfather made it a point to say he's part of this extended clan. And later on, through documentaries, through some research, I found out that surname, that's my mother's clan, does in fact have that lineage. It goes all the way back to the Yuan dynasty and this Turkic general that had come over to govern Yunnan. So it's a known thing, apparently. It's a thing. He's a homeboy. which and of course the relevance starts to become clear, right? If you I look obviously ethnically Chinese in Singapore. We tend to put the community into these buckets, very crude buckets, and of course it's a legacy of colonialism to put these very complex, nuanced regional identities and cultures and traditions and languages into buckets. So in Singapore, the buckets are fourfold: Chinese, Indian, Malay, and others. Literally others, with a capital O. It's hilarious. And so, of course, these very crude buckets lead and cover up all kinds of complex and interesting histories. I was fortunate enough to have heard this story about an illustrious ancestor. I think the more interesting point is not just that Zhen He was a distant great uncle, but that it therefore implies that my ancestors were Muslim, and I'm technically a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
Very good. I mean, I don't think any of us on the panel can make greater claims than this. Perhaps Yvonne will tell us she's related to Jomo Kenyatta at this point.
Yeah. So,
I'm related to my mother and father. That's far as I can go. But maybe we can segue from this to a more specific set of conversations, because it's quite clear that what we're talking about is a kind of transoceanic conversation here, where Nairobi is in conversation with China, is in conversation with India. It's not surprising that the two of you should have met up in the cosmopolitan state of Kerala, which has always been connected through the ocean to spaces like Rome for over 1,000 years and so on.
Absolutely.
So what I wanted to ask here is that Alvin said something very resonant and poignant, that there is a way in which nations reduce our identities. There is a myopia of the imagination which creates a space called the country, and within that country creates non-miscegenated identities. Identities are almost hermetically sealed. There are Hindus and Muslims and Chinese and Malays and so on. So what I want to do is to ask you 3 questions to just open it up and open up the conversation, which relate to the work that you do. And the first thing is that I just would like you, for the purpose of our ocean as method, oceanic imagination, cosmopolitanism, the various themes that we are going to be talking about, could you tell us something about your writing and the worlds that it tries to create? Worlds that have been forgotten, worlds that exist, but are besides one point of view, not very visible. That's the first thing, the writing and the worlds it creates. The second is that while it's very evident to any reader of your work, that your work is basically about the world, right, as it is. It's not about a particular place. So do you see a distinct maritime or an oceanic imagination in your literary writing? Would you say that this is something that informs your writing? And finally, I mean, I know that Alvin has done a PhD, and so he's also an academic while at the same time as being a writer. Yvonne's writing inspires academics like us because there is a lot of thought that has gone into creating a particular geography of affinity, where suddenly China gets connected with Kenya, and Kenya is connected with Turkey through one character. And in between is that space of the ocean where people speaking multiple languages, possessing multiple identities come together. So writing in the world, the oceanic imagination, and what is the relation between your academic output and your literary one, so to speak? So perhaps Yvonne could go first, and then Alvin could go second, and then we'll go on to Nishat for the next set of themes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I will echo Alvin's statement of gratitude and thanking you for this particular moment. In response to that, writing, writing in the ocean. I think Alvin and I think Dilip also, you alluded to it. The categorization, the typologies, the confinement of the human being. As an artist, I've never found a box I did not want to get out of. And I think the constraints of the imagination of the world, the projection of that small imagination upon certainly our lives, the lives of the imagined peripheries such as ours, means that as I walked into the world, both as a human being and as a witness to the world, I think I was both irritated and surprised by how small the world was compared to what the world is and in my own country, right? There's a contradiction as well as the conflict of the imagined self in Kenya. And I say that, I used to say that lightly, but I didn't realize how important that was. Within a radius of 1 kilometer, you're likely to encounter at least a minimum of 5 different languages and cultures. But certainly at the basic level, you're at least going to encounter 5 different languages spoken within just a 1 kilometer radius. I can stop in one of the streets of my own city, and this is part of my growing up. And I thought the world was like that. I could walk from a temple to a mosque, to a Catholic church, a Presbyterian church, to the Freemason. Literally walk. I could skip from door to door. Again, in a very within a crossroads, and the ease of wearing worlds. I could mourn the death of my Muslim friend's mom and go and weep with her, and it was this kind of ease that stepping out into the so-called big world and finding that all of these things became contested spaces, contested sites. So as part of my own writing, not necessarily as therapy, but as a form of meaning making, was to reconcile that or come to terms with that, or come to peace with the paradoxes of encountering a world that was supposedly bigger and superior, and finding that it's actually much smaller than what I knew. And yet that same world looks upon the worlds in which I have come from and regards it as small, as undeveloped, as unsophisticated. So there was that aspect as a motivator, curiosity about human beings, and my own passionate and unrequited love for the seas, particularly the seas others call the Indian Ocean. I'm insisting on calling the Swahili seas, but finding that it has many names and many faces. And that was influenced, of course, by a lot of that was influenced by my own time at the Zanzibar Film Festival. Which again, a place like Zanzibar as an island is a microcosm of the entire world. to encounter in that space, and it did quite a mind job on me. Expanded, especially my idea of where Africa begins and ends, beyond the terrestrial, finding that so much of Africa lies hidden in the seas, and the narrative of that is also lost, has also been seemed to have been lost in our post-independent, post-colonial imagination. I was working in Zanzibar doing the film festival, Worlds of the Indian Ocean, discovering, creating a kind of imagined geography linked to the seas that bind us, and therefore showing works. I remember, opening one of our film sessions with Makbul. But it was absolutely right to be there, and what I found, just watching, was amazing to see how when people came from the seas, from wherever in the world they came from, actually including Brazil, frankly, there was incredible sense of I think I was struck by the fluidities of identities. When the sea is involved, suddenly a lot of the nationalities fall away. And the contestations, some in a light-hearted way, came around, what claims do we have of these particular seas that belong to us? So we talk about a maritime imagination. I think as part of my own identity realization is to understand that that's intrinsic. That's part of my own belonging. My role then is to try to figure out the extent and depth and scope of that.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. I mean, it's actually about writing the world as it is before your eyes, in which you've experienced, and writing it against the world as it has become, so to speak. Yeah.
Beautifully put.
Alvin,
Yes.
over to you.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about this in three aspects, which resonate with what Yvonne has said. So the first aspect is positionality, in the sense that my writing life, I think, is intrinsically tied up with being Singaporean and being Southeast Asian in general. You're talking about a part of the world that has always been at the confluence, as it were, at the crossroads of trade routes, cultures, traditions, since time immemorial, right? And we were always part of that connection, economic, intellectual, going back centuries, if not millennia. I think it's not really surprising in that sense for someone coming, and in Singapore being an island, being steeped in trade, being steeped in global economic flows, as it were, to sort of speak to and relate to that sense of being in the middle of things, in the marketplace, as it were, of the world, and being comfortable with that sort of, I think some have called it a Thessalocratic sense of imagination, in that sense that, it's about trade routes and networks rather than about holding territory, as it were. And I think the civilizations of Southeast Asia have always had that sort of perspective. And it is, as Yvonne says, very different from the world we were educated into believing as being the norm, the ideal to aspire to, which is the sort of very British middle class idea. When I was growing up, there was no sense whatsoever of Singaporeans being cultural producers. We were brought up to be consumers and clerks. This goes back to colonial times. We were brought up to be good administrators of the British system of law, government, education, and so on. There was no sense that we were also meant to tell our own stories. Art came from France, religion came from China, India, and the Middle East, so on and so forth, right? Sex came from the US, etc. There was no sense that we could have our own thing. This was, of course, completely at odds with what we saw as a ferment, right? As a sort of bubbling forth of all kinds of really, frankly, much more exciting things. Just take food, right? For an example, Singapore is a crucible for cuisine that has taken from all the different great traditions in the world. Recently, they won, I think we won some hawker World Heritage status for our hawker food. And it's ground level. This is not Michelin dining. This is not the food of kings. This is ordinary street fare that draws from all these streams that we've been exposed to. The language, of course, you talk about Singlish, so on and so forth. So one, there's just so much more to us than the world allows or recognizes or celebrates. That's one. Second aspect has to do with the kind of work I do. I'm a poet, and I think I was drawn to that because of the musicality and the imaginative possibilities of poetry. In a society where our founding prime minister, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, famously said that poetry is a luxury we cannot afford. We've been set socially in a decidedly prosaic, prose-based, material, technical sort of path. Pragmatism, economic growth, etc., etc. So, like Yvonne, I think that the sort of temptation to push back against that, to celebrate, the music and song in language, in ideas that I saw all around me, right, was just a natural sort of resonance. And later on, as a translator, as an anthologist, this idea, this instinct to always bring together what has been set apart, I think has characterized very much my work, So we're always wanting to gather the waters, as it were, to sort of pour different streams and to bring them together rather than to police the boundaries. And I think the third aspect, which only came later, is the more scholarly one, the more academic one. The more I got into the research side of things, I'm also an editor-in-chief of a public policy journal. So my work starts to draw in that prosaic side of life, as it were. I began to realize that these were questions, as you would no doubt know, that are becoming more and more resonant, that are becoming relevant in the 21st century in an increasingly globalized world. So the sort of metaphors I think Yvonne and I have been reaching for, the sort of methods, the sort of rebellions, as it were, the sort of mischief we've been up to, turns out to, like in the tech world, turns out to be exactly what the human species as a whole might need and look forward to and want. Good, right time, right place, I suppose. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, right. So that, as you pointed out, Yvonne, that the place that you come from was very cosmopolitan. And it's only when you went out to face the larger world, you realized that the larger world was actually very narrow. So that takes us to the next theme, which is, so is there a distinct politics in your aesthetic engagement? Do you consciously write about your position, the location that you come from? Because as you know, in the Dragonfly Sea also, there's at one point, the character Ayana thinks that the word Africa, it triggered some stupidity hormone. How much of that consciousness of location, do you have at the back of your mind while writing? And secondly, this question is to both of you, because Dr. Pang, you also write with a very conscious, with the consciousness of your location. That is very visibly there. So do you also see yourself as a writer engagé, so to say? These current paradigms of decolonizing the imagination, all these theoretical, glissants and other theoretical positions. Are you conscious of these theoretical positions while writing, while undertaking your writing? So again, we can go the same way. Maybe Yvonne can answer first, and then we can go to Dr. Pang.
Okay, thank you for that question. I approach the writing space. Sometimes I call it the dojo. With a kind of imagined openness to what emerges. I adore story and its rules and its implications. So the notion of story truthfulness, character truthfulness. And my late friend, Binyavanga, was the first person to tell me, Yvonne, get the hell out of the way of the story. And if it happens then that the characters adopt, aspects of my own kind of political irritations seep into the lives of the character, it does so purely in error. But yes, I guess as much as one adores story, I'm also, even if I'm an amanuensis for the story passing through, the story itself must be influenced by the things that I see in the world, I see of the world, the questions I have in the world, from the place where I am in, sometimes Nairobi, sometimes the ocean of East Africa, Kenya and Africa. Looking at the world, and sometimes in places of Europe, of India, of other places, looking at Kenya, for example. So yeah, aspects of these, of course, will leach through, whether one wants it or not, as part of the kind of identity in and of the story. In terms of the notion of the decolonization, the global decolonization movement, I suspect, because I think we've had this conversation a little bit with Alvin. My own quest, Nishat, is to wonder: do we have another grammar for what needs to be done? I'm not interested in centralizing the Occidental experiences and its impacts on our lives, to preoccupy my next century of existence, my next half century of existence, with mulling over what the West had done. I'm interested in the interstices of possibilities, what the future might hold, what a grammar of the future might represent, especially as we see, certainly in kind of the zeitgeist of the time, the movement of the world, the shift of the world towards our seas, towards what is called the East, but it's not necessarily just the East. There's a shift happening in the world, and I'm mostly interested in what is the grammar and the language of us in the imagination of the new world that is coming, of the world that is coming. It's probably already here. And in that, that's where I feel the greatest urgency, both as an artist and as a human being, in terms of asking, what then is my role as an artist in that space? It's a liminal space for the time being. What does it mean? What is its language? What does it mean for my relationships with you, Dilip, with you, Nishat, with you, Alvin? And how then do we speak us in a way that we have not spoken about us and for us for a long, 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 long time?
Right. I mean, you made me think, and made all of us perhaps, think, do we have a grammar to articulate who we are? And that is probably the question that Alvin's writings have consistently been engaged with. So what to you, Alvin?
Yeah, so many ways of looking at this very much resonate with what Yvonne has said. I do a lot of the sort of analytical work and looking at world affairs and things like that in my sort of editorial work in public policy, which is why when it comes to my creative writing and my poetry and fiction, I think the impulse is primarily not politics but play. And I think one of the things I learned over the years, it is precisely the fact that it is not teleological, that it isn't founded on these sort of markers and indicators, that writing becomes its most subversive, right? I found out that it was subversive to not particularly care as a writer about the readership markets in London and New York, right? And to be more interested in what you think, Nishat, and what you think, Dilip, and to have conversations with Yvonne and the readers we've encountered over the years, that these sort of communities of practice and readership and connection matter more to me than the sort of traditional structures of intellectual and literary power that we've been told to look to. and of course, I speak from privilege. My particular circumstances in Singapore, which is a relatively affluent country, allow me to not need to make a living from writing. I think that's been quite liberating. The fact that we have our own sort of literary mechanism in Singapore has, out of necessity, mind you, has freed up from that dependence that still catches many people in this kind of loop. I think it's very important that we start thinking of that grammar, and we've been talking about the language of confluence. I think Yvonne and I have been having conversations about that, and it might come up as a metaphor for thinking differently about oceanic connections. So that's one. But also, I think it's important to talk materially about relations, right? Are we reading each other's books? Why is it that our bookstores stock books from, London and New York and whatnot, rather than each other's books? Why don't we have these? And in fact, I think COVID has been brilliant for this, because it's out of necessity broken down some of these assumptions, right? Zoom means anybody can connect from anywhere. We can have this conversation. Before COVID, we might have had to meet, Yvonne, perhaps, in a Paris or a London or a Berlin, rather than at will here, as it were. Why don't we build on that? Why do we not have our own sort of relations, sidestepping the middleman? And in a sense, and of course, those, since your histories, ironically, it looks like a return. It looks like a return to the state of the world, to a state of oceanic connections that existed before the 16th century, and the sort of European incursion into our space, as it were. It looks like a return to that. But I'm not looking for necessarily a return. I think the fact of that history tells us it was possible and may be possible again. It is not unviable. We don't actually need that intervention. But then, like Yvonne, I look to the future, knowing that this was possible, knowing that it is desirable now. What then can we build together looking forward? And so a lot of my work recently, like my fiction, has been speculative, looking forward to 100 years at imagining different sorts of world order, not all good, but different from what has come before.
Thank you. I mean, both of you have raised a very important set of themes. And I think when Yvonne said that we need to move away from a certain kind of post-colonial rage, which is reflected in Caliban's dilemma. You taught me language, my profit on it is I know how to curse. And what Alvin is saying is we are stepping aside from this towards conversations with each other, conversations across the global south, which are bringing back memories of earlier conversation. So it's no longer directed outwards, but is directed amongst ourselves. And certainly, as you point out, COVID has democratized that space of interaction, that we can speak to each other across time zones and spaces. The second thing about the conversations across the global south, again, and when Alvin spoke about return, again, it was poignant for me because I grew up in India, in post-independence India, with figures who were very familiar. Lee Kuan Yew was part of my imagination, so was Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta. These were the figures that were part of our imagination, including that strange Yugoslav general Joseph Broz Tito, right, because of the non-aligned world. So I think if we are thinking about these larger imaginations and also trying to revolt against what Alvin called a certain kind of thalassophobia, fear of the ocean, that the ocean kind of got written out of our lives because of imperialism. We became terrestrial entities, right? National entities, bounded entities. How do we bring the ocean back in? And at no point in history has this become more important than now. Right? With global warming, the water's rising. It's not the water lapping at our feet. We are up to water to our necks if we are conscious of this as a problem. And the fact of water lapping at our doorsteps. So how do we think and write, as Amitav Ghosh asked us, how do we write with this exigent problem? That there is global warming, waters are rising, islands are going to vanish, right? And there are many islands which have already been submerged. Jakarta had to be relocated, as we all know. A new capital had to be created for Indonesia. So bringing back the oceanic the imagination, requires writers such as yourself, academics such as ourselves, Nishat and myself, to think with global warming, think with climate change, think with the ocean, and to move away from what Amitav Ghosh called that great derangement, where we imagine the world is going to continue pretty much as it is. So is this a major concern, or should this be a major concern in our work? So return back to the question of a politics of life, not a politics of the mere allocation of scarce resources, because Singapore and Kenya are very special places as well. Singapore is an island. The waters could take it away, right? Just as much as Kenya, the ocean is lapping Kerala, where I come from. Kerala was created for recovery from the ocean could take it back. So how do we think about these exigent politics of global warming, rising of the waters? What do we do as writers and academics? Maybe we could reverse the order and start with Alvin. Yeah.
Well, so I feel passionately about this. I think one thing to note is when we use the ocean as method, it's worth remembering that we are not just talking about the literal ocean, the waters. Obviously, it is important. The seas regulate climate, as we know. But I think the bigger point here is to remember or perhaps remind ourselves that the ocean tells us and reminds us, we are islands, but the sea is whole. The ocean reminds us that many of the issues we face are interconnected, that the boundaries we have set up between professions, between roles, between academics and creatives, between, to some degree, nations and borders are well, not necessarily arbitrary, but they are fluid. Right. Look at, again, COVID, right? A profound lack of understanding about that fluidity has allowed this pandemic to spread. A certain part of the world believed they were immune from the China virus or the Asian virus, at the same time as they were perfectly happy to have profited from the labor of Chinese peoples and markets. So I guess it's not about blame anymore. It's about us as a species realizing that we depend on each other. We always have. We trade, we love, we buy, we sell, we make war, we connect. And to think oceanically, I think, is to remember that those fluid relations are what, not the boundaries we draw around them, are what actually moves the world, where our energies come from. And knowing that, tracing where they're coming, where they're going, who controls the floodgates, as it were, who's damming them, who's channeling them, and whether they can be reconfigured in a way that is more beneficial to the human creature as a whole. And I think that requires us, again, maybe this is a very Southeast Asian thing, that requires us to think beyond our silos, think beyond our comfortable boundaries of what we're supposed to do or not do. And I think in that sense, not only can academics play a part and writers play a part and everyone, businessmen play a part, we have to. We cannot afford to not chip in wherever we can and find a way together to move forward. Or die. There's always that alternative.
Not a good one.
No, not at all. But there's no guarantee that we will survive otherwise, isn't it? Yvonne, sorry.
Okay. I mean, I love what you've said, Alvin, and I return to that word you keep using often, and I hope you can talk about it a little later, the idea of confluence. But Dilip, in reply, when I was doing this research around the Dragonfly Sea, and for the first time, again, one of those overdue things, speaking to those who actually look at the world from as if they were in the middle of the ocean. A couple of things struck me, and goes back to that call for another grammar of us, another grammar in which the histories and the ways in which the ocean has storied itself in the lives of the many who have, for whatever reason, entered into silences, what that can actually speak to us regarding this present time. You know, this is not the first time the oceans or nature has raged against humanity. And there's so much knowledge and memory of responsiveness embedded within cultures that have just been written out or disappeared, and I'm not blaming anybody, because as a privileged post-colonial, one also has played a role in being blind to and deaf to what actually exists as a template for us. I remember when at the time of the tsunami, the casualties along our part of the world was extremely limited. I mean, it wasn't much, because, again, when I was speaking to some of both the fishermen and the boatmen, they had read the seas the previous night before the tsunami came. They had read the seas, and they watched the behavior of the ants, and the movement of the birds, the direction of the fish. And so a lot of them had beached their boats before the ocean hit. Before the ocean, surged. And I think this story is repeated in several places of the world, where the fluidity that Alvin refers to between selves, between worlds, and when I say world, I mean our world and the ocean world, where the lines are very, very thin. And when I speak of that language, the grammar that that becomes part of my own quest in rediscovering or reactivating, what lies there that can speak to this particular present moment? And I think that was one point. The second point is that the second thing I learned from my great teachers, the fishermen, the boatmen, was that the human panic about our transience, the fact that we will die, is not such a big deal for worlds, for where the idea of every day is an encounter, is a kind of gift of presence, of taking the day as a gift, and being grateful that you return. So on Pata Island, where the story is set, one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced was the return of the fishermen. Every single day, there's a new song of gratitude for the return. Would we, I don't know about different cultures, but I've become suddenly more aware of our terrible relationship with transience, with death. And to wonder what other vocabulary might exist beyond that which we have adopted, which have become a part of our lives, that allows it to become part of our own narrative of being in an easier way, in a simpler way, to gaze more kindly at the world, even in its brokenness. I don't know. I guess kind of, yeah, I think those would be some of the thoughts that quickly emerged.
Yvonne, what you just said reminded me of that speaker and her book that we both encountered together in Bremen, ironically. Remember Karin Ingersoll, who wrote a book called Seascape Epistemology, and this might be absolutely relevant. Seascape Epistemology, Karin Ingersoll, she's Hawaiian, and she investigates and examines what her indigenous Hawaiian heritage can tell her about exactly these issues. And from that, she speaks to her version of an oceanic method that has to do with a very different relationship with land, with culture, with history, with death, with life. One point that stuck in my head, for example, is they don't regard the sea and land as separate entities. They're continuations of each other. And in a profound way, with tides and ecosystems, they really are connected. What you do on land affects the sea and vice versa. that's built into their particular epistemology. So she tries in her book to draw that out in a way that is resonant and applicable to some of the questions of our time. And one of the things, of course, she notes is something we have also noted, is that we've moved away from that, right? We've lost, erased, cut off, whatever you call it, for whatever good or bad reasons. We've downplayed those particular forms of thinking that used to sustain us.
Right, and possibly what we shall need to see and what we shall need to engage with is what, to paraphrase Foucault, we need an insurrection of subordinated knowledges, such as what Yvonne spoke about, the knowledge of the fisher people, the knowledge of those who have lived by the sea and have lived by the rhythms of the sea and so on. Thank you so much. Nishat, over to your next question.
Yes, thanks Dilip, and thanks Alvin and Yvonne for your very powerful words. Alvin, you pointed out that we need to rise beyond our silos, and Yvonne, we really, have this very troubled relationship with transience. I mean, these are the things that we really need to think about, and that takes me to the next theme, which is, your writings are about lives on the land as well as, oceanic lives. So, how do you put the two together? What does it mean to think with ocean rather than land, with people on the move, with so much of migration? And Yvonne, you have spoken about migration, that only one aspect of the narrative is written about, which is migration from south to global north, but the other part of the other side of the story is never written about. So there is this dominant narrative about migration. So is a writing practice that engages with ocean very different from terrestrial or landbound novels? And the next question linked to this question is, does the idea of archipelagic imagination connecting people across space and premised on imagined affinity resonant in your work? I mean, does this idea resonate in your work?
Okay. Again, thank you for those insightful questions. Now, writing from the ocean as opposed to writing from the land, it does make a difference, absolutely. Certainly for me, I don't know about others and their practice. One, because one writes from what one loves in many ways, and I write also from what I do not know. I do not know the ocean, but I do know that I love the ocean, and it's not a quantifiable or a logical love. And I know I'm a better human being when I'm when I'm in the ocean, and when I'm close to the ocean. And it also means then that, and as one who is completely influenced by the landscape in which I find myself, what I write close to bodies of water and even and close to the sea is so completely different from what I write in an urban space. What I write in Nairobi is not the same thing I write. The feeling, the emotion, the whole things that come together within, and that then manifest as words, or as words on a page. It's like it's almost like as if they are two different beings working on one particular story. I'm not sure it answers your question, but all I can say as an artist in practice, what I write by the sea is very different from what I write when I'm in the hinterland. And actually my writing in the hinterland, in the urban spaces, no matter where it is, whether it's in Berlin or in the mountains of Switzerland or Swaziland or even in Nairobi, is always tinged by a longing for the sea. There's not a day in which I'm in this city, in these spaces, when I'm far from the sea, that I'm not longing for the sea. So that probably conveys itself in a kind of yearning and longing in the text as well. Archipelagic thinking, to be Kenyan is to be archipelagic. The idea of a people who are mostly migrants, who have come from somewhere else, and yet who have found a place of belonging in this fluid space. The country itself is a very fluid space. To be able, Nishat, you'll come to Nairobi and you will be mildly scandalized when you hear Nairobi people claiming samosas and chapatis as owning it, and we will fight. We will fight. We will plant our flag in our statement that chapatis and samosas and biryani and pilaus are Kenyan.
You can have
and
Next, you're going to say Tiger Balm is from Kenya, right?
Tiger Balm too. Tiger Balm. I had my Tiger. Tiger Balm. So there's a way in which the people of the archipelagos, wherever they are from, converge in different spaces and find their belonging. I went to Kerala and thought I was in Nairobi. Everything about Kerala was so familiar, in a kind of uncanny, and kind of like I had to be reminded several times that I was not in Nairobi. There's a familiarity of rhythm, of feeling, of cadence, of smell, there was a. It's one of those things that you can't put words to, but you remain haunted by it, and I could quite have profound, I could proclaim Kerala as also my home, with a certainty that I could find my way. I knew which streets, even though I'd never been there, I knew what I was going to find down the streets. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the idea of the archipelago moving beyond just the consideration of islands and oceans, and the archipelagos within that we contain, that we run into, and you meet other islanders who are not necessarily from the place where you were born, and you find your resonance and commonalities and familiarities, and even language, even though you don't speak the same language.
Right.
It's also about the sea that is within us, isn't it? I mean, our bodies are literally seas. We get pulled by the tides. Like the tides, we get pulled by the moon. There's a way in which, on a very material, phenomenological level, our bodies make a difference. So it's not surprising, Yvonne, that you write differently by the sea than on land. You know what's the really odd thing? I can only write fiction when I'm by the sea. And my very, very first poem was about the sea. Very first one. And it came about because I had read two poems about the sea. One was Alfred Lord Tennyson's Break, 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 on thy cold grey stones, old sea, cold grey English channel, he'd lost his lover, oh grief, oh emo, etc. And the other poem, which we were asked to compare it with, was this anonymous poem about life by the sea, written for colonial students, right? School children, one of those textbooks. They didn't even bother to acknowledge the author. And it was all about how life by the sea was all coconuts and lazing by the beach and catching fish, because of course that's what we do in the tropics, right? Between those two poles was my experience of the sea that I had never seen in writing. And that's a lot of where my impulse comes from. But it isn't just about filling a gap. It isn't just about resistance. It was also about love, which is what Yvonne said. It was that pull towards something that I knew deep in my blood, and I don't use the word blood lightly, I knew to be true, that at the same time did not come out in anything that I had encountered or read. And I think that sort of ineffable aspect of writing is very, very important, because that's what keeps us going beyond the sort of intellectual concerns, which are important, beyond the political concerns, which are important. I think that pull in the blood, call it desire, call it yearning, call it love, I think that's really, really important. But related to that, I want to address a point that was raised by a student in chat, if I may, who raised the point about the ocean as possible an escape, and a sort of escapist reality at a time when borders are closed to us. Is the ocean a place of escape? Perhaps for some, but I don't necessarily see the ocean in romanticized terms. I love the sea, but it is it is also a place of terror and danger, right? Let's not romanticize the ocean. Respect is different. Love and respect is different from, I think we still need to maintain a healthy, not necessarily distrust, but fear, or perhaps is the right word. Nature and the ocean are not terra nullis. They've been presented like that on maps. You look at a map, the ocean is blank, right? You have lines in countries, you have things in countries. The ocean isn't actually like that. It is teeming with forces and with energies and so on, and that we know very little about. So I think that's important to take note of. And the other point is, of course, we talk about global south a lot. There's so much global north in us. We are all confluences of north and south. And maybe it's time to acknowledge that as well. Just look at the language we're using and the technologies we're using to have this conversation, right? And I think let's acknowledge that it is this dynamic combination that makes it possible for us to imagine a future, right? And in the world that we're moving into, have perhaps moved into, perhaps these boundaries, these terms, north-south, may no longer apply. I mean, the Bundle Conference is behind us. Maybe we need another one, a different kind of imagining. Anyway, enough from me.
No, that was very well said, because life by the sea is not completely dissociated from inland politics that keeps encroaching on oceanic life as well. So maybe that will take us to the next question by Dilip.
Yeah, actually, this does allow us to segue into the next question, because so far we've been speaking in largely in terms of hope, right? Rather than in terms of romanticization, that we are trying to envision possible futures from past that we have forgotten about, right? I mean, in some sense, there is an element where we stand at the cusp, somewhere between land and the ocean, and try to imagine other histories, other possibilities, and so on. And while we are aware of the possibilities of the ocean, I mean, for me, and this is something that I constantly invoke, the spectacle of Syrians walking across the water to Europe, right? And it's a contemporary miracle. I mean, it's something that we read about in our religious texts of a singular prophet walking across water. Here, there were these hordes of people who did not see the ocean as a boundary or did not hold any terrors for them. But all that aside, I think we also need to step back a bit and ask ourselves, we've already spoken about global warming, right? And the end of the world and our fear of transience and so on. But we also need to think about the fact that we have to reckon with the forms of violence that are associated with the ocean, whether it's the coming of colonialism to our spaces, whether it's slavery, the carrying of 3 million people across the globe, their lives scattered and shattered. Think about the experience of indenture. Think about the experience of piracy. Think about the constant shadow in the Dragonfly Sea of Islamic militancy, which invades even the small island, right? Where seemingly there is a harmony possible. So while we are aware of the possibilities of the ocean, how could we centrally think about violence as constitutive of human history, and how would we think the ocean through this? Right? This is not necessarily to counterpose, but to keep it within the horizon of our thought, as it were.
Mm. Dilip, my first encounter with the ocean was the thing that entered. And it was its violence, the beauty of its ruthlessness, and its violence, and I saw what it did to boats. The awareness of all that, not necessarily all, but a lot of what it is, and its unpredictability, and I do not think that our reflections or our considerations or even our search for the language of of a method that comes from the ocean can preclude and exclude its capacity for extremes of evil, on its own terms and as a projection of our own, and as a platform through which human beings encounter one another in the most ruthlessly grotesque of ways. And sometimes I don't know. I think there's so many possibilities with this. The ocean as portal, and the unknowing of what comes through. The ocean as mediator of human conscience or of human consciousness, and what it allows through. Ocean as filter, ocean as membrane of the collective human experiencing of the human being. I don't think anything can be excluded. And I think what would be, and it's part of the excitement of it, I think, in terms of also finding the languages, the words, the nouns, and the world and the imagination that has been created out of its particular penchant for violence. I only look at that as a realm of possibility. Yeah.
I think what we need to do here is a reckoning that has, to be fair, isn't necessarily new, that has begun, in the past few decades, which is a thinking through of the way in which human activity, all aspects of human life, are steeped in complexity, as is nature, and again, just quite, in the first place, questioning that distinction between human and nature, which is, of course, an Enlightenment construct. And just thinking about, if we're talking about a method, it is a method of, it's not formulaic so much as it is an active, attentive negotiation and engagement with the world, with its movements and energies. It's a consciousness that as we move through the world, as we make our way through the world and try to shape it, there's an extent to which we are in turn shaped by it. And also that, a sailboat moving through the waters goes in a particular direction, partly through the pilot's effort, right? A certain skill to do with being able to steer, being able to work the sails in an appropriate manner to go where they want. But the driving forces belong to external forces. It's the wind, it's the water. You are negotiating with the elements to go where you want to go. You're not going to change the waters fundamentally. Even the greatest ships in the world can cut through the water, but still rely on its properties of buoyancy, et cetera, et cetera. And it's about maybe a return to that sort of attentive negotiation. I mean, of course, I'm not the first, by any means, first person to say that. There have been thinkers that have thought about writing that way and creation that way and moving through life that way, Deleuze and Guattari, for example, who are in turn building on other kinds of knowledge, But maybe it is about that, right? Method as unmethod. Might be what the ocean teaches us, right? Doing away with what has been called an overly zealous hygiene, this idea that we need to sort of cling on to the way, right? Capital T, capital W, as it were. When in fact, the very act of navigation and negotiation involves a certain fluidity in ourselves. We have to swim in it, and let it carry us.
That's excellent, Alvin. It is taking us away from the kind of narcissism that goes into ideas like the Anthropocene, where earlier if human beings created the world, now look at the destruction we have wrought. There's always we are at the center of this. And what you're reminding us is really that we need to move, as many historians, many academics before us, as you've said, that it's not about looking at history in the ocean, what humans have done in the ocean, but it's a history of the ocean. Right? What has the ocean done? how do we look at the waters and the ocean and nature in ways that are not only refracted through our ambitions and our navel gazing? And I think that's a fundamental point to think with. But Nishat, I think we should be getting on to the last theme before we open it up to the audience.
Absolutely. We have very smoothly and beautifully moved to the last and most important aspect of language. As Yvonne pointed out earlier, that ocean, it is materially present. It can be materially experienced through the language that she uses. And after reading your poems, Alvin, I can say the same thing about your writings. What role does language play in your writing? Because ocean is a polyglot space, as are the port towns and islands and other spaces which are contingent on the ocean. So, what does it mean to write, polyglot fiction? What does it mean to write, with this consciousness of ocean, because I mean, Yvonne, in your writing, for example, if you look at Ayana, she thinks of all these Sufi mystic poets, women poets, and with her father she sings Bollywood songs.
Yes.
So yeah, and similarly, Alvin, in your writings also, I mean, you use Singlish, and which is all kinds of colloquial languages of Singapore in your writings. So, what role does language play? And secondly, does the idea of Creole and Creolization, which is of course very important here, resonate with your work?
It's almost as if after just with this discussion, I'm suddenly thinking maybe the ocean as method has happened long before this conversation. In that people refer to the polyglot nature of this book, The Dragonfly Sea. I don't teach it as polyglot. No, I don't, for the simple reason that because of who the ocean has brought, by means of, it was the primary roots was the ocean roots, by those that the ocean brought into my milieu, into my space. If I'm a fish in this kind of East African space, intrinsically as part of my beingness, as part of in this space, I am many. I am multiple. I am many languages. And I negotiate worlds within myself and outside of the world across many languages that I encounter, and I encounter with ease, right? So this book, in many ways, it's a microcosm of the East African space, of the East African ocean space. And I repeat, we go to a place like Pate, where this book is set. You're not just going to encounter multiplicity. You won't encounter the multiplicity of languages, but what you will encounter a common language, Kibajuni, a variation of Kiswahili, but you will encounter the faces of the entire world that have been brought together in this space to belong to Pate Island. But you can see, that looks like a person of, has got Portuguese ancestors, has got Indian ancestors, and there's a whole history of those who came from the Indian subcontinent and settled in that part of the world. You meet the world in the body, in the physiognomy of peoples. I mean, I think I'm almost tempted. Creolization is so important, but I'm almost tempted again to go back and not necessarily looking for a tabula rasa as much as saying there is more. There's a complexity. There's a more to us. There's a more to us. There's a more to our way of being, oceanic, that has been lost in the last couple of centuries of incursion and amputation. And perhaps that too needs to find its language. I never find it's never enough hanging around these spaces, Lamu or Zanzibar or even Pate Island. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that. And I think to an extent also Kerala, to go in there and find the language, the vocabulary, the grammar we have for what we see and what we experience of each other in that space is insufficient. Yeah, so I think that becomes part of my own quest, the digging, excavatory process of trying to find the thing that encapsulates both the wonder, the mystery, and also the strangeness of that. Yeah.
So I love what Yvonne, what you said about the sense that there is more to us, because that's profoundly an impulse of mine as well. You know, that there is so much more to us, and by us we mean all of us, not just the oppressed or the dispossessed or the South or the North or what have you, but all of us. We are in a sense reducing ourselves collectively and the cosmos collectively with the sort of language we have been using to talk about each other and talk about ourselves. I mean, take language, right? What language isn't a Creole? Right? All languages are derived from long periods of evolution. You can politicize it, and of course, languages are profoundly political in the material sense. But they were all the product and outcome of certain histories and certain flows and uses, right? All languages are Creole. So in one sense, I resist the notion of Creole and Creolization as characterizing my work, partly because I resist that idea of distinguishing between a pure and Creole language in the first place. Well, all languages are Creole. Specific to Singlish, I like to say that Singlish is a pidgin that has been regarded as a patois that may be in the process of becoming a Creole, perhaps maybe. To translate, Singlish is to me a market English that has been regarded as a broken English that may be in the process of becoming perhaps a new dialect of English, right? Where you stand, how you see it, says more about the perceiver than about the language itself. It is very much in flux. It is very much, in fact, it's not even one thing, it's multiple things. You can talk about Singlishes. Individual backgrounds matter, individual families matter. It isn't formalized, has not yet been formalized, although you could point to it and say, yeah, that's Singlish, but there are many Singlishes. So my writing has in fact been inflected by that realization. Now in the 50s, there were a series of fairly well-known writers who are now distinguished scholars in their own right, who tried to come up with what they called Eng Mao Chin in Singapore. Eng Mao Chin being, a sort of made up word for English, Malay, Chinese. They tried to formalize that colloquial language that they saw all around them in the 50s. It utterly failed. It's in the records, but it failed partly because the authors who wrote in that language couldn't really get away from the idea that it was impure and corrupt, and so their sort of their hang-ups overtook their innovative excitement, I think. So when I work with language, I actually take a completely different tact. While some of my experiments resemble some of theirs, I'm not coming from the point of view of wanting to create a dictionary of Singlish. I'm not looking to formalize. In fact, I'm trying to subvert the whole idea of formalizing it. I'm trying to return us to the notion of babble, of play, of fluidity, of saying, look, this draws from my history, the places I've been to, the people I have loved, and whose breaths have become part of mine, right? And let's not forget, breath and air are also fluids, and therefore also oceanic, and we don't speak without using fluids, if you know what I mean. So my language background and therefore the writing I use drawing from that is specific to my history, even though it might in fact be shared. And it is this, I wouldn't even call it duality, but this sort of ambiguity and fluidity, Yvonne, that I think resonates with what you're saying. It's very much all around us, and we might take particular whiffs, particular flavors, spice our language, but we don't want to pin it down. That would kill it.
Right. So there is more to us than the available idiom, available grammar offers. So we need to explore that more. And maybe if you read out a little bit from your writings, our audience can, get a sense of what you're trying to do through your writings. Yvonne?
So I shall read from the Dragonfly Sea, and because this is an oceanic conversation, in the scene, just to set the context, after a whole lot of stuff happening, bad things happening, but also some good things, our main character Ayana decides to return to the ocean. Let me read it here then. She dived. The sea was liquid charcoal spattered with the innards of moonlight. She tumbled into the seduction of the deep, craving its feel, pulsing water, no gaps in the ocean, no distances between beings. She sank deeper, losing the sense of up or down. The sea, its iridescent layers, a creature burning an inner fire floated past. Her ears popped in the cooler waters below. Water citizens of many shapes and hues swam around her, an eel-like translucent being, round eyes on her, a shoal of tiny silverfish nibbling at her bare feet, tickling her skin. Soft, serene, sinking, and familiar calmness oozed into her, dissolving time and trouble. The ocean pressed hard against her lungs, but she had borrowed enough air from the surface not to mind. She settled into the arms of her ocean, cocooned stillness. It was easier to drop than it was to ascend. Homecoming, the murmur of jinns. She remembered then to twist her body to propel it back to the surface, kicking the water, tears melting into the sea, just as light had done before her. Bursting for breath, almost swallowing water, she surfaced. She let her body choose its direction, drifting. Every day was the same day, every night the same color of nothing. Ayana discovered that nowhere was also an inhabited space. And somehow a year slipped by.
Wow. One can almost feel the ocean all around oneself. Alvin?
The piece I'm going to read isn't explicitly oceanic in content, but perhaps it is in character, and language plays a part. So a bit of context, and this is one of those poems that comes from both play and rage, right? Righteous rage, I assure you, very righteous. So a couple of years ago, there was a British comedy sitcom called Cold Feet that came to film on location in Singapore, right? And it hit the news. None of us had watched it, but it hit the news because they had reported going back after filming on location in Singapore. They had gone back to England and then photoshopped the footage because they said it didn't look like Singapore enough. In other words, it didn't look Asian enough. All the street signs were in English. All the buildings were, looked like the ones we had in Manchester. It didn't look right for TV. I wonder why. And so they literally were very proud of the fact that they went and photoshopped that footage to make it look more like Singapore. And this is a piece written in Singlish, Singaporean English, or at least my version of it, in response to that, shall we say. So the producer, this is a quote, the producer said, "We had to make it look a bit more like Singapore, given it was Singapore." Hey, not spotting lah. Make people go extra, draw snake, act leg mouth to make the place look more like its own self. You see lah, all those years of speak good English, until now people cannot tell this from Manchester. Got tall building, got people, mountain people, sea shopping center crowd, got rain, got drumpy taxi driver, got rush hour traffic, got Scottish bridge, even got big grey building with fake Greek columns, just like theirs. Always like that. Die must supple all their angers wrath until they give up and cancel. Cannot just be humble, know your place, pretend not to understand, smile. Dog mouth cannot grow elephant teeth, understand? Asian road signs must be Asian. Asian buildings must be Asian. Asians must look Asian. Cannot be too clean or white or macam London banker. If not, wait, next time people confuse jabot elsewhere, how? Tax incentives wasted. Tourism board angry. Then finish. This kind of chapalang, not 3, not 4 island, who wants to come?
Absolutely wonderful. Yes. So Dilip, should we go for audience's questions?
Yes, I mean, probably Stephen could take us through the audience's questions for around 10 minutes or so, as we had planned.
Yes.
And then we can round up a brilliant session.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you've answered Sango's question, but I'll ask the question once again if Yvonne wants to answer that. Amitav Ghosh in his Ibis trilogy looks at the sea as a marker of the interconnected realities. Do you think that the challenge that we face in today's world is that with the borders becoming closed, the ocean offers an escape from harsh realities?
Alvin did take up this question,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
So probably, unless Yvonne has something to say, we can move on. Yvonne, do you have?
I think it was adequately covered, but I think maybe my little input there would be that the idea of the question to me, I think, points to a kind of sense of it just shows the extent of our own amputation and distancing. The fluidities that we mentioned have become so calcified that we would treat the ocean as a thing to go to in order to leave reality, rather than understand it or see it or witness to it as a part of our reality. I mean, there are all sorts of things embedded within that particular question. Ocean as passageway, ocean as possibility, ocean as worlds, and ocean as continuities of our, of our lives and of the spaces we inhabit.
I would just add also that the term escapist belies a certain kind of judgmental perspective. One person's escapism is another person's Elon Musk. Right? Where does escapism end and speculative innovation begin? Again, it's bound up, I think, in a lot of assumptions which are part of what we're trying to untangle and perhaps dissolve. And perhaps other questions might speak to the same. Yeah, maybe other questions, might allow us to speak more to that.
So this question is to Yvonne. Can you put some light on oceanic thought in cinema, and what is the difference in the visual language when a director thinks from or across the seas?
I wouldn't dare presume on the marvelous capacities and skills of other directors. I'm a storyteller primarily, and yes, I did do the film festival, but as an administrator. But maybe what can what might help a little bit was that when we're doing the Zanzibar Film Festival, it is a fascinating experience working with global directors who had been reflecting on the seas, not necessarily the Indian Ocean or the Swahili Seas. And drawing them in, finding justifications, curating the process so they come to inhabit the temporary space that we had created that hosted the citizens of the seas, the citizens of the waters. I mean, all sorts of things erupted and unfolded in that convergence of peoples. Whose single identity at that moment, we discarded all other identities other than the identity of belonging to the sea. And we had hoped that more stories, more films would emerge out of these particular encounters. Not that it quite happened that way, but yeah, I would, it's a question I'd love to take up with other directors.
Thank you. Jonathan asks, just wanted to push that last point a little more. For example, is it possible to discuss the difference between the kinds of oceanic and island writings associated with Glissant, Walcott, Brathwaite, and other writers from the Caribbean, or from Ingersoll and your own works? Also, to perhaps distinguish more your own approaches from the border, archipelagic, and relational thinking which is taking place in the Western social sciences and humanities in European and USA universities. That is, are there are there different tropes or themes at work as well as similarities?
There's a lot to be said about that. A couple of chapters in my PhD about that sort of thing.
Which you should tell at this point. Yes.
Right. So what I'll do is perhaps summarize where my thinking is now, which is to say, you can sort of distinguish where the Pacific ends and the Atlantic begins, and where the Indian Ocean ends, and where the Arabian Sea begins. But you can't really be precise about it, because there are bodies of water that interpenetrate and influence each other. So too, I think, the world of knowledge. I can certainly say I've drawn on many of these sort of, our Sea of Islands, and of course, some of the thinking of people like Bruno Latour and Ingersoll and Deleuze and Guattari, etc. I think what they do have in common is a renewed interest in the sort of fluidities that I find very exciting and resonant in my work. And to the degree that you see those things show up in the work of Pacific Island writers or Caribbean writers, I'm like, that's cool. There is a kinship there, just like I found a certain kinship with Yvonne on many levels because of the ideas that we shared, and also because the context in which we encountered each other. I think, where does it, to what extent was it important that we were writing about similar things? To what extent was it important that we were talking about those things in Kerala? I would say all of the above were relevant, right? And you can't really draw the line. Now, that's it. I do think the specificity of these writers and their work matters. Specificity tells us and speaks to the precision of local detail, right? And so I wouldn't want to just sort of generalize and say, oh, they're all ocean as method, they're all oceanic thinking. I mean, on one level, you can say that, yes, it's like saying they're all water. But on the other hand, I think you do have to look at the context in which they were writing. You do have to look at what they were speaking to and from and perhaps against. To sort of tease out, I think, the nuances. My work speaks to my very, very specific background and experiences and sort of politics and the things I care about and think about. I do think there are some overlaps, but I wouldn't want to sort of, put everyone's eggs in my basket, as it were. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. There's a comment by Shatrupa Mishra. Ocean Rimmed World by Joe DeCruz speaks of an ocean that gives but also takes away. The title, in fact, presses upon the significance of looking at life and the predicaments we find ourselves in through the lenses of the ocean. So the ocean is a symbol of interpretation per se. Then there is a question by Priyanka. Can we therefore just say that what you suggest by ocean as method could be about making a plea to rewriting world history, which will not emerge out of the comparative or difference or specific, even disciplinary history as such, but from history that is reflexive or linked histories? How should we think of the specifics then of the internal forms and structures? How do we do then that then in this kind of method?
Alvin, do you want to take that one?
I mean, one way to approach it, and probably not the only way, is, to paraphrase Latour's method, follow the actors, right? Trace the flows, see where they lead you. What are these forms you mean? Where do they come from? Where might they be going? Do they come from particular ways of seeing the world, or framing the world, or sources of knowledge? Are they directed towards particular aims, right? Their energies come from somewhere. They're not immanent, out in the world. They come from particular impulses, particular agendas, particular epistemologies, as it were. And there might, for every story that pushes, for every story that leads to a form, there might be so many other ways of looking at that same phenomena in different ways and different forms. And also forms shift and evolve, right? And this is where I sort of wax lyrical about poetry. In Singapore recently, since 2014, there has been this online phenomena, which I helped to start, but it's way out of my hands now, called Singapore Poetry Writing Month, right? And what happens is every April, every day in the month of April, thousands, and I literally mean thousands of writers, poets, young people, some of whom have never written before in their lives, come together and write poems, one poem a day for 30 days in April, every April, and they share them on Facebook, and they get comments. From that comes books, from that comes love affairs, from that comes writing groups and all sorts of wonderful things. It's about the foment, right? It's about that sort of oceanic sprouting of energies, rather than, oh, where is this going? Do you need a grant? We kept saying no to grants, because what would you do with that money when the best stuff was already free? and one of the things that has come of that is a great sort of revival as well as innovation of traditional literary and poetic forms, right? Tremendous. So both the history lesson and the futurist lesson have been happening at the same time. What binds them together is the desire to create, to communicate, and to connect. And actually, in a sense, I'm hoping that is what drives us. We must want to do this. We must see the value in it, and then we will find a way.
That's so spot on in one sense, because the late lamented anthropologist David Graeber, who passed away recently, anarchist, anthropologist extraordinary, he said that a lot of his academic colleagues spent months of their life writing for grants and so on. He just sat down and wrote the books that he wanted, and left behind a huge legacy of absolutely stunning original thinking. And that's perhaps what we need to be thinking with here as well, because to organize this conversation required very little, just an internet connection and the will to speak to each other. So I think that's a great note on which to end, Alvin. And perhaps we could now just start wrapping up our session, because we don't want the numbers to rapidly dwindle even as we speak. We can't see them slipping away, but they are.
So maybe, sir, there are a few questions. I think the conversations can happen later as well. Now, maybe Professor Dilip Menon, you can conclude this session.
Well, actually, we'll both try and make a few remarks, I think. I mean, Nishat, if anything comes to you as well. I think one of the most interesting things that was said here was, among the many insightful things that was said, was this question of being polyglot. And Yvonne said, well, she doesn't necessarily see herself as being polyglot, because a lot of what we are is shaped by colonialism, and a colonialism that was not multilingual, right? They were monolingual colonialists who suddenly occupied a multilingual space, and we suddenly saw ourselves as different, rather than speaking many languages as being a state of being, against which the impoverished nature of monolingualism should be contrasted. So when I go to Macau, when I go to KL, when I go to Zanzibar, when I go to Calicut, or I go to Doha, suddenly I'm aware that I'm in a space where people are speaking multiple languages, and I feel so much at home, because there's always some language that I know which allows me to communicate. And as we said earlier, it's a desire to communicate that makes language, rather than an inadequacy of language that prohibits communication. So this question of the circulation of languages, the circulation of histories, the question of history as a kind of history writing, fiction writing as a kind of seance, right? Where we are bringing back these spirits from the past in many senses, bringing them
Beautiful.
back to converse with us. They're knocking on our table. Yeah, and we need to speak to them.
Beautiful.
So I think those are the kinds of...
Or perhaps, borrowing a metaphor from my heritage, it's a kind of ancestral worship where you pay your dues to the past because they continue to have an impact on your present and future.
Right, but these ancestors speak to us, right? They've been coming back and we are in conversation with our ancestors rather than merely venerating them. And I think that's really the kind of space we are talking about. That was the one point. The other thing that we need to think about is that the essential nature, I mean, what E.M. Forster said, only connect. And I think this is, again, something that both Yvonne and Alvin have been stressing, that what we need to be doing in our lives, in our imaginations and in our writing is to stop raging against a past, right? Stop raging against something called colonialism, and to think about the connections that existed prior to colonialism and to continue those conversations, build upon them, much as we are doing now, located in 4 different spaces, but engaged in a very common enterprise, I think. There was a way in which we began the conversation and slipped into each other's group perfectly.
Easily, yes.
Isn't it? I mean, we know what we want to say to each other, and there's so much in common. And I think this is important also because if somebody were to tell me, look, but at the end, you are resorting to English, which is the language of the colonizer. It's just that, I mean, I know very well that there are many Englishes that I speak. When I speak with Nishat, when I'm in Jamia, the English that I speak, I'm not always thinking, am I going to include the semicolons in my conversation with parenthetical observation? I just move between languages.
So Dilip, a point I like to make is we seem to have this hang up about English, but we don't seem to have the same hang up about money.
Money will go round.
I rest my case.
So I think there's a whole set of issues here which are related to a certain kind of cringe that comes to us from colonialism. And that's the colonial wound, so to speak, that we have to heal. Right? But we have to start speaking to each other, move past the trauma, and realize that there is much that we have in common. And finally, I think the important thing, there was a question that was raised about, is Ocean as method merely about now speaking about other histories and so on, thinking about interlinkages? And Alvin answered part of the question, but I think the more important thing is to actually think with water. What does it mean to think with water? It's not just about collating all existing histories and thinking about connections, but to relate centrally to the fact that there is one element that we have excluded from our imagination and from our prose. It's not about just bringing together the histories of Mongolia and Singapore and Kenya and the United States and so on, but to think with water. And my colleague here at University of Witwatersrand, Professor Isabel Hoffmeyer, will be coming out with a book shortly, which looks at what it means to think with water, what she calls a hydrocolonialism, a hydrocolonial politics. And I think that is where we need to move. And in many senses, I think thinking with water also weaves its way, flows through, circulates. There's a fluidity across many of the themes that we have spoken about today. And that's all I have to say. I could go on forever. And I look forward at some point to meeting over a glass of tea, a cup of wine, a plate of beef in Kerala.
Okay.
Can I offer?
Why not in Delhi?
Invitation. An open invitation to all of you. If you ever come to Singapore, when it becomes possible, look me up, and we will go out for a meal and or beverage of your choosing.
Wow. Great. Yes. Thank you, Dilip, for summing it up so beautifully. And thank you, Yvonne and Alvin for this very brilliant session. I really don't have anything to add to that. Yes, we can clap. It was amazing. It was a brilliant session, no doubt. And one is still left with so many questions, but we know that, such conversations can never end. These are just the beginnings. This can never end. I'm going back with so many aphorisms, so many questions, so many things to think about. And I'm sure my students present here and the rest of the audience, they will also, go back and think about so many things. And some of them are already sending me messages that they are going to read Yvonne's novels and Alvin's poetry. So we have really achieved something, and I really hope that the affinities and the connections that we have found here and formed here and forged here, we will, they will continue. We will get more opportunities in future to cherish these affinities and connections. Thank you so much.